And
We're sitting in Grandma Gordon's living room in Wolsey, South Dakota. This is August 18th, 19th, something like that. 1986. We're going to chat with Grandma a little bit about her past and South Dakota's past and some of the interesting things in her life. As I understand, Mother, you were born in Spink County in South Dakota, near Frankfort, Dolan, in that area.
Well, we were a long ways from Frankfort and Dolan in those days, but our post office was Liddell. That was a little country store that had no railroad service, but it had mail service by Star Route.
That would be located a little north and east of Wolsey, isn't that right?
Oh dear, don't ask me directions.
Sort of that way.
Well, it was in Spink County, Redfield's north, so it was northeast of here.
That's what I always thought. That was in 1898. How did your family get to South Dakota?
Well, they were pioneers, you might say. My grandfather was the instigator of coming. He learned of this land in South Dakota that was being put up, not South Dakota,
Dakota Territory.
Dakota Territory was being put out for homesteads. And he came from a big family. He was an evangelical minister, and it was a meeting in the East that he had gone to, a meeting of the conference of the evangelical church, and there he learned about this prairie state of prairie territory in the West. They called it Dakota. It included South Dakota and North Dakota and I believe a little part of Montana and Wyoming. I don't think there were any boundaries in there.
So I remember from history it was a big, big territory. That was the Hoy side of the family. That was your mother's side, right?
That's right. And Uncle Samuel, the minister, had several brothers, and they all had big families. And a lot of boys. And he was concerned about the boys living in Ohio was where they lived. They lived at Napoleon, Ohio. And he wanted to get them out a bigger country, get them some land and get them established in life out there. So he talked several of his brothers into going. And they all took up claims in this locality. The railroad went to Dolan. That was the way they were coming, and they had to drive out till they found land that they wanted, stake it out,
And register it.
then get into Redfield, the county seat. But
And they had to clear it and get dwelling
they
place
didn't have any
built.
clearing to do. There were no
That's-
trees.
that's
It
right,
was
it was prairie.
absolutely prairie ground, and much of it was buffalo grass. And of course, the buffaloes had roamed this part of the country always, and they left marks of where they had been. We called them buffalo wallows. There's a big bowl-like hole in the ground, and that's where they went to roll in the dirt.
Scratch the backs.
I guess that's it, scratch the back. Anyway, that was where they congregated there. The school I went to, there was a buffalo wallow just across the road. Every once in a while, a bunch of us kids at recess decided to go look at the buffalo llama. My mother's cousin, she didn't come out with this Hoy group, neither did her father come, but her oldest brother came,
Oh.
Harley Hoy. And she says that my mother was only 16 and that she wasn't allowed to take a claim until she was 18. Well, if that's the case, she took it when she was 18 because she had a claim. Because my brother was born in the claim shanty, and my mother's claim shanty. So I know she had a claim. I know where it was. I couldn't go there and find it because the country's so changed that it just doesn't look like it used to look.
There's, so the argument was about when she took it and her age.
Yeah. I thought she took it when she came, but
And she was 16
she
when
was
she
16.
came.
She had-
Obviously, she wasn't married to your father at that time. She
No, he
came
hadn't
with.
even. He was living in Indiana at that time,
Mhm.
and a little later, his dad got the wanderlust, and he decided to go west. So he sold his drugstore and
You
home.
remember what town in Indiana?
Decatur, I think it was. Decatur, Indiana.
Could be.
He lived at Macon, too. Macon, Illinois. But I think it was his father was a man that didn't like to stay in one place too long, I guess. Because he came out to Dakota Territory and the claims were all gone, but he bought a homestead relinquishment.
Uh-huh.
And it was in the same neighborhood that the Hoy claims were. So they lived right there close to the Hoys. In fact, my mother as a girl worked for my grandmother Allenson
Oh, really?
as a hired girl.
Mm-hmm.
Were there Indians and
No, I don't think there were Indians. I never saw one, but I always was scared at night that there might an Indian come.
What about buffalo? Were there buffalo still around?
No buffaloes around. Although you found places where they'd been. I'm sure they picked up buffalo chips to burn.
Mm-hmm. Was there any military posts in nearby or anything?
Not any near at all.
That was a little after that post-Civil War era, that when the military, the John Wayne movies kind of thing.
Well, the military post was established along the Missouri River.
Yeah,
But
and you were quite a ways
we,
from that.
We were long ways from that. We were close to the James River.
what was it like, Grandma, when you were growing up there on in that area? What did they plant and what did they reap?
They planted wheat. They didn't raise corn. They didn't think it was a corn country. The season wasn't long enough to raise corn. And they raised some other small grain, oats and spelts.
I've never heard of that.
They didn't have anything like Milo or
Yeah, alfalfa.
we raised millet, but it wasn't the millet they raised today. I was so surprised when I saw some millet. It's big stuff, but the millet they raised was in a little head about as big as a wheat head, and it was just little round balls like mustard seed. That was what I knew as millet.
That's what I thought millet was too. How did the economy work? Did all these crops you grew, were you able to sell them?
That was when they had to go to the railroad.
Mm-hmm.
They'd take that long drive with their load of wheat. Wheat was what they sold.
Mm-hmm.
And get up and leave 4:30 or something like that in the morning and drive the 15 miles to Doland, 18 miles to Frankfurt, Frankfurt was usually the best market. They had a mill at Frankfurt. Roland, I don't think ever did. I never heard of it anyway. So they'd be gone till 10 o'clock at night. They'd always bring a load home with them of something.
A seed or something, or
Well, it was usually feed for the house.
oh,
Coal.
right.
Coal was one thing that they in them that they brought almost always, because there was no wood to burn. You see,
Mm-hmm.
some people twisted hay and burned that, but my folks always got the coal.
But what was your heating system? Did you have a stove like a Franklin stove? Or it certainly wasn't open hearth.
No, they didn't have that. I think they just had the little Ben Franklin stoves, some of them were called, but the base burner, when I was a girl, was the heating stove. Everybody had a base burner because they circulated the heat in the room better. That was why they were called a base burner, I guess, because the
The
heat,
heat came out of the bottom and then rose, and so there was
the
circulation.
heat went up and around and
Yeah.
then out the back of the stove. There was a hole back.
Mm.
There was always room behind the base burner to settle a chair and raise your bread back there.
Oh,
And the baby's crib
yeah.
would be put back there, and me with my growing pains in my legs was always told to lay down there and put my feet under the stove, because the bottom of the stove was warm, you see. And the base burner, I had, it always burned hard coal, and it had glowing coals, and the doors to the stove had isinglass windows in.
Mm-hmm.
So there was always a bright light
Mhm.
coming from it. The old base, and there was a place on the back too where you could cook.
You simmer beans.
And there was an oven there too.
Oh, was there?
On ours there was. Some didn't have a big oven, but my mother, you see, that's quite a story. Grandpa Allenson got tired of living in South Dakota, and he decided they'd move to California. So they did. And I don't even know who might have lived on the place for a while, whether it was rented out or some of the Hoys lived on it or what. But anyway, Dad started up a courtship by mail with my mother, Murray Hoy.
Who was then in California?
He had to go to California, of course, with his folks. He was a young
Oh,
man.
he was in California. The Hoy stayed in South Dakota. The Allensons went to California. Got it.
Grandpa Allenson's whole family went. There
Yeah.
was Aunt Clara and Uncle Bert and Dad and Grandma and Grandpa. Aunt Clara was the youngest.
Who was Aunt Eva?
Oh, Aunt Eva was in there too. She was next to Aunt Clara. Mustn't forget her, because
Of course not.
she was quite a person. Aunt Eva was. She never married, but it wasn't her fault.
Just the boys didn't ask her. Or the boys did ask her.
Well, maybe it was my fault. Anyway, when she was being courted, I was a little girl, and she was babysitting with me. And I embarrassed him, I tell you.
What did you do?
I wanted, Aunt Eva, will you please unbuckle my panties? And that was a very embarrassing situation for her.
I can imagine.
Anyway, the man that courted her was coming clear from Hitchcock on horseback. And in later years, his children, he married a Hitchcock girl, went to school to me in Hitchcock.
Is that right?
Yes.
Well, back to my Grandpa Allenson, Ernie, was courting your mother. He was in California, courting her by mail.
He decided that she was the woman he wanted to marry, so he wrote to her. And she decided she was going to want to marry him. But she wanted to live in South Dakota. She didn't want to go to California. So he came back to South Dakota and married her and took over his father's place and bought it from him later. And my mother told me she always had a little fear in her heart that he was going to want to move back to California, and she didn't want to leave the Hoys. We were a big family of Hoys in that community. In fact, there was a Hoy baseball team. Everybody that played on the team were Hoys.
Oh, really?
And they were a good team.
Now, this would have been in Dunny Hoy's day, wouldn't it? He was about the turn of the century.
But he never was out in South Dakota.
Oh, okay.
He went, instead of coming west, he went east.
Mm-hmm.
Or else he stayed in Pennsylvania. They came from Pennsylvania originally.
Well, the Hoys you speak of, I remember those from the Hoy picnics. There was Aunt Lindy and Aunt Frank and Uncle Albert and Uncle Nate.
Who?
Uncle Albert?
Yes.
And Aunt Emma?
Mm-hmm.
And Uncle Nate?
You remember Uncle Albert?
Oh, I remember them as being old people living in a house in Huron with a porch on the front of the house. But they were ancient.
I think you remember them in the country.
No.
They were only in Huron just a few months, and Uncle Albert was sick.
That's the time that I remember them. I don't remember them being in the country. And Alva, was he? He was the son of Uncle Albert.
Yes.
Oh, so
Uncle Albert was one that took up a claim when they came out in the early days. And he had, his oldest boy was born in Ohio. He was about the same age as Uncle Albert's youngest brother,
oh, that happens. That happened in Bob's family too.
Dick.
So that was it was part of that group that was living in the Spink County area.
Yes.
And then,
Well, of the claims that it took up, Aunt Frank took up a claim, and Aunt Jo took up a claim. Then my mother was the next in age, and I never heard of Aunt Lindy taking up a claim because she would have been too young.
mm-hmm.
And the boys, Uncle Albert took up the claim, and then all the other boys were younger, so they didn't.
They had to wait until they were old enough, and
And
by
well-
then they were gone.
Wasn't any claims there, but they kept on living around there.
Well, you had two brothers, one older and one younger. So
Right.
Uncle Earl was born first after this
Yeah.
courtship and wedding took place. Then you followed 7 years later.
4 years later.
4 years later, okay. And
Earl
then-
was born in 94, and folks were married, I think, in 92. My mother was teaching school. She went to Brookings College and then taught school at the same time because the school terms were so short. I think they started out with 3 months and then they kept adding on to,
Was your mother your teacher?
no, she wasn't teaching school when I was born.
Oh, of course not.
She never taught school again. After she taught those 7 years in the one school. And
Well, was that the school you went to that she had taught in?
No, I didn't go to that school. I went the other direction.
How many kids were in your school?
Oh, a room full. I suppose 16, 20.
And this was the traditional one-room schoolhouse
Yes.
with one teacher who
And there was a Hoy that lived across the road from the schoolhouse. In fact, he's the Hoy that I was named for, Jess Hoy. And his sister still lived at home. They were children of Uncle Samuel, who was the evangelical minister
That started the ball rolling.
Yes. And his daughter Lillian, was my first school teacher. I went to my mother's cousin. It was my first teacher. But they moved to Oregon after Uncle Samuel died. I didn't know too much about that trip to Oregon or why they went. But I never did see them again after that. There was a John Hoy, a brother, that came out, and he had a family of boys. I think that's the extent of the ones that homesteaded here was Uncle Samuel and my grandfather Joseph Hoy and his son Albert Hoy and Frank Hoy her name was Frances, and she took up her homestead. And I think Dell no doubt was right that my mother took her homestead up a little later. And John Hoy, now I don't know, there was a John Hoy and a John W. Hoy, and I never got them all straightened around.
Well, let's move along here. Was Uncle Ralph born here or after you moved to Gary?
He was born at Gary.
How old were you then when you moved to Gary?
I was 8, had my 9th birthday that summer.
Tell me again about that move. Your dad had gone ahead?
My dad got tired of the long hauls to market with his grain. And we had no telephones, no rural routes, of course no automobiles, and no good roads. And a little farther east, they had those things. They didn't have cars farther east, I remember. The first car I saw was the year we moved to Gary, in the hills.
Would have been 1906.
1907.
That's okay.
Maybe I gave my age wrong.
But 1907 was when you moved to Gary, and you saw a car at that time. That must have
After
been a
we'd been there a while, Earl came rushing in and he says, "I think there's an automobile coming. I can hear something." And so we all watched, and sure, top of the hill, down the road, we saw one come. Then it went down the hill, of course, and then up the hill, and finally,
Oh, what fun.
I think it went on by. I don't remember that it stopped.
I'm going to remember that the next time I'm on the Long Island Expressway.
Friends, and they were very congenial. They just got along just fine. Mr. Greeley liked Dad, and Dad liked Mr. Greeley. And Dad told him what he was coming for, and he said, "I've got a farm, Gary." He says, "That's where I'm going now. Why don't you buy it instead of the Robinson farm?" And didn't sound very good to Dad because it was too hilly and too much waste land, and all the gulch and everything. He went on, made a deal with Robinson to buy the Robinson place. It was 2 miles north of the Greeley place. And the man that was living on the Robinson place didn't own it, he rented it.
Yeah.
And when he heard the place was sold, he thought he had to get off. But Dad wasn't to take possession until fall. But he moved on, so that left
It empty.
it empty. So Dad rented it for the summer and went over and put in a crop. And he took most of our household things, left enough in the house for my mother's two brothers to batch there and take care of the crop there. And school wasn't out yet. So when school was out, my mother and I and Earl drove across the country with the driving team and Surrey. The Surrey is a two-seated buggy, but it doesn't have a box, just has the floor to it. It's more like a chariot type
Yeah,
thing.
it has a floor and then seats. So it's not like a wagon with sides. Did it have a top?
Yes, it had a top, but it didn't have fringe on it.
It didn't have fringe on
It
it.
had a regular buggy top. But I've seen many of them with a fringe on top.
So if you were 8, Uncle Earl was 12. He was probably a husky teenage boy by then.
He very, very much developed. He developed young.
And this was quite a ways. This was over a quarter of the state you were covering. If 15 miles to Dolan was a long way, this must have been 200 miles, 150?
No, it was I would say it was just under 200 miles, maybe 270 or 80.
170 or 180.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
one.
What would take it takes about 3 or 4 hours today to drive it.
3 or 4 days.
3 or 4 hours today to drive.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, okay.
With a car.
Right, with a modern highways.
Uh-huh.
So this in 1907, how long did it take you?
Oh, it took
In
us an
Missouri.
age because we had so much trouble. I think my mother planned that it would, well, we were going to stop on the way anyway and visit her friends. But actual traveling time, I think, was only 2 days.
Would she have been pregnant then?
Oh, no. No,
Oh, I thought Uncle Ralph was
born in 1910.
13 years, 12 years younger than you.
Uh-huh.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay. All right, that's one problem she didn't have.
Well, we were going along pretty good, and we were packed in that Surrey like sardines.
You had the rest of the household goods with you.
Well, we had our personal things, which weren't very many in that day and age. I'd hate to get part of my things in the back seat, besides putting a girl in there. But they had it packed pretty solid and left just a little space at one end for me to sit, and Mom and Earl in front. And I had my doll, and Aunt Eva lived right across the road from us at that time, she and Uncle Bert and Grandma. And she had given me a coconut to eat on the way. And that was a novelty, to have a coconut. I don't know where or when, how she had it way out there in the country. And of course she gave me candy and stuff like that too. She was always doing things for me, making my doll's clothes, and hanging May basket on our door, observing every kind of a holiday. Of course, I suppose you'd call me a spoiled brat, because I was the only girl in our family, the only niece in the Allenson family, and the only granddaughter in the Allenson family. So that,
Oh, my.
my dad's side of the house really spoiled me. Well, I think I got spoiled a little bit from my mother's side of the family too, because Uncle Ross, her brother Ross, lived with us a lot of the time. He taught school and stayed there, and he was always doing things for me. And Uncle Dick, the younger one, he liked to tease me, but he sure was an awful nice Uncle Dick. He did a lot of things for me. He didn't marry very young. Uncle Ross married, and his wife got tuberculosis. That's where you got the idea of tuberculosis.
I guess it must
probably.
be.
And they had a baby, but that didn't live, which is buried out here by Lake Byron and in the Piper pasture. Little stone there and tell us who it is.
Oh, if you would get back to this 2-day trip and the trouble you had, you ran into. You were there, you had your candy and your coconut and your little place to sit.
Yep. Well, Mama and Earl took turns in driving. And Earl was driving, and my mother said, "Look out, that mud hole ahead looks pretty deep. You better go into it slow and easy." So he did, and he got stuck. And the horses didn't stop. They just kept on going. So he had to drop the lines and let them go. After they got out of the mud and water, they stopped and turned around and looked at us. So we had to walk to the nearest farmhouse that we could see. They were real fine people and took us in and pulled the buggy out, Surrey. Put the horses in the barn in a box stall that had been occupied for a while. And one of our horses picked up a nail in his hoof and went lame. So they had to take him to a veterinarian and get the nail out and wait till he was through being lame. So there we were at the stranger's house for several days.
I guess so.
And there was a young lady in the house, I don't know. She was the daughter. She taught me how to sew during that time. My mother never would let me use the sewing machine. She said I had to learn to sew by hand. But this lady says, "We'll make that doll some clothes." And she had some white goods. She says, "We'll trim it in black. We'll use black thread." I can remember that. So she did a lot of stitching on the white. And she let me pedal that old machine and steer it a little bit. After that, my mother did let me sew sometimes. I learned quite young to sew. Well, we went on to Castlewood, where her school pal lived. And we were there for 2 or 3 days, visiting there. Then we got up early one morning and headed for Gary. And got there just at dusk.
And this one then was the first place, the Robinson place. that
2
you went
miles
to.
farther than the
Yeah.
one. Well, Greeley couldn't get over the fact that his dad should have that farm, so he offered him a pretty good deal on it. So Dad sold his farm to friends up in Spin County that had come there on account of the Hoys from Ohio. My mother had gone to school with them. And so they came to Gary and lived on what we call the Robinson place.
Yeah.
It became the Adams place.
And then you then moved to the one where you grew up.
Yes.
So now you're at Gary in 1908, and you went to school there. You went to grade school, country school, and then you went into Gary to high school. You lived in this big house. Uncle Ralph was born in 1911. 1910. You were telling us last night about how your mother died when you were 14, and Uncle Ralph was 2, and Uncle Earl would have been 18.
He was in Brookings College at the time. I want to tell a little bit about this house.
Please do. I only saw it once.
As I said, Dad got acquainted with the editor of the Dakota Farmer, Mr. Greeley, on the train. Dad had taken this Dakota Farmer, and one issue a few years before, the front cover had a picture of the Greeley house. It was down in the gulch, and trees all around it, and the yard kept up beautifully because he had sheep that he turned in to keep the yard good, and a lovely little bubbling creek running through the yard. And my mother said when she saw that picture of that beautiful home, if I could have a house and home like that, I would never ask for another thing in this world. And
So your dad got it for her.
that's right.
That's great.
It was really wonderful. The tragic part of it was that she didn't live to enjoy it as much as she might have. But the little time she did live, she really enjoyed it. She was brought up in Ohio, and of course there were lots of wild shrubbery and wild berries and lots of trees and everything. And Gary reminded, the gulch there at the Greeley Gulch reminded her of Ohio. And so she and I, many and many an afternoon, would take a sandwich in a sack and go for a walk in the woods. And she would identify so many different things growing there. The wild columbine, the Dutchman's breeches, and the black haws, and wild blackberries, and wild plums, and many, many oak trees, beautiful oak trees. And the basswood tree was another real pretty tree. And Dad owned 80 acres that the creek ran through. So you see, we had
Pretty sizable.
we had that 80-acre length
Yeah.
that we could explore. In fact, I didn't ever get it very completely explored, because I could go back places that I didn't get that I did a pretty good job of it though, because we went often, my mother and I did, that first year. Then the next year, her sister, Aunt Lindy, lived up here in Beale County, real close to Liddell. They went to the Liddell church, and their house burned down. And they had planned on moving out of the country too, because they didn't like those long drives. So they came over to Gary, and Uncle Sword worked for Dad that summer, and they lived with us. And that was the year that my mother and I, well, that was 1909. There was a year between that when we were
Yeah, I understand.
there at home. But my mother had so much company. She always loved company, and that big house had 5 bedrooms upstairs and 1 on first floor, and it had a parlor and a living room, and in the parlor we had a couch that converted into a bed. And so that could be made into a bedroom. And we had a couch out on the porch that people slept on real often. Many a time, those beds were full. I remember one time when we didn't have room for everybody, and there were some Hoys came to visit us, cousins of my mother's that lived at Groton, South Dakota, which is near Doland. And of course, this was after the days of cars. They had a car and they wanted to go places, and they came over. We didn't even know they were coming. That was after my mother died, too. And I was taking care of the house, doing everything. Didn't know what we were going to have for supper. It was Sunday, so you couldn't go to town and go to a store. But Dad went up and picked the strawberries. He got a big lot of them. Of course, we had lots of cream because he ran a dairy. And we'd sold the eggs on Saturday, but he went out and gathered eggs, so we had eggs. Of course, I had bread. And I don't remember what I'd baked, but I always baked on Saturday, so there was cookies or cake or something like that. So that was our supper.
Eggs, bread, strawberries and cream.
And cake and cookies and whatever it was.
That sounds like a reasonable Sunday night supper.
Well, when it came to going to bed, they didn't have sleeping bags in those days, of
No.
course, but we had a lot of comforters. My mother had made these big, heavy quilts. So we spread upstairs. There was a big hall, big enough to put a bed in, bigger than that. And so we spread these comforters down on the floor. And these boys, I can't remember whether it was 3 or 4, but I think 4 boys slept on the floor.
And
in
that
the
was a
hall.
Methodist bed, wasn't it?
Yeah. Another time when we had so many people, why, my brother put a tent up out in the yard, and he and the boys all slept in that tent. And they slept on the ground, but they had horse blankets that they brought in and used.
Which horse blankets were the forerunners of sleeping bags.
I guess so. Because we used horse blankets when we went in the sled, in the bobsled in the wintertime. And we had good robes, but when you get in the bottom of a sled with hay and they cover the hay and then you get in, you get snuggle down in that, and it's nice and warm because usually we had hot bricks that were put in too.
Oh.
But there were the horse blankets that we had if we needed them, and then the horses got them put over them when we got someplace. So because they would be.
They'd be sweaty and they cool down cold weather. You went to country school there.
Yes, that was just a mile. I thought that was fine because I'd had to walk a mile and a half before up in Spring County.
You never took a horse? You always walked to school?
Oh, we took horse a lot of the time.
Oh.
Because my aunt, Eva, was living in California, but she came back to South Dakota to teach our school.
Oh.
And she lived with us, and of course, we had to drive then all the time.
Couldn't have a schoolmarm walking a mile
No.
to school.
But I watched it though. I don't know why. Whether she stayed later and worked or what. There was another family that lived, so they always walked. And I guess that was why I walked. I wanted to walk with them.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. Then you went into Gary to go to high school after you finished 8th grade.
And I drove from home with Beauty and the buggy.
Well, Uncle Earl would have done the same thing 4 years before, wouldn't he?
Well, he rode horseback.
I see. So then you took a horse and a buggy.
I did go horseback a little bit, but I usually drove.
Is that where you met my dad?
No, I met him before that. We went to church, of course, and the Gordons were good Methodists. And Mother Gordon and my mother struck up a very strong friendship. And Sunday dinners were all the rage in those days.
Oh, yeah.
And we'd go to the Gordons for a Sunday dinner, or the Gordons would come to our place for a Sunday dinner. And of course, the Gordon kids were thrilled to come out there to the gulch.
Oh yes, that'd be a fun place to
That
go
was,
to.
we'd have dinner and then
'Cause
away
they were
we'd
town,
go,
they were town kids.
exploring the gulch. I remember we were in the gulch quite a ways down, and somebody says, "Where is it that man hung himself?" I said, "Oh, that wasn't in our gulch, that was in Uncle Thord's gulch." "Well, I want to see the place." I said, "Well, it's quite a little ways over there. We'll have to, if we go home and then go, it's a long ways. We can cut across here." So we climbed the hill, climbed over a fence, over to the railroad track. And we followed the railroad track and inched ourselves down that high embankment till we got down to the bottom so we could look up and see where he jumped off the arch bridge. Barbed wire fastened around his neck.
Oh my word. Ugh.
And my uncle had found him. Of course, that was after my mother had died, and Grandma Hoy felt sorry for me. She was always helping out. She'd come over, and she was at our place, and Aunt Lindy called up, and she said, "Is Ma there?" "Yes." Grandma answered the phone. "Lind, do you know what a tragedy is?" she said, and I thought, what in the world are they talking about? "Okay, I'll be right over." So she hung up and she says, "Lynn wants me to come over. And she's sending Miriam and Sarah over here."
They were the little girls. Aunt Lindy's little girls.
So you won't be alone. So there we Miriam came in and she says, "Something happened at our place. I don't know what it is, but they're awful secretive about it. Dad came in the house, white as a sheet, and they're sent us over here. They wouldn't let us stay." Well, we couldn't settle down and do anything. We didn't.
You want to know what had happened?
A car drove in the yard. Our men were all out in the field working. I don't know where Ralph was. I guess he was taking a nap. And this man got out of the car and came to the back door, and I went to the door to answer it. Scared and didn't know what was going on, and he said, "Where is that dead man your dad found?" I said, "What?" He said, "We got a call." I said, "I'm the sheriff from Clear Lake. We got a call that your dad found a dead man." And I said, "Well, my dad's out in the field working." I said, "I don't think he did. It was him." I said, "You made a mistake. You're supposed to be at Berriman's instead of Allenson's." "Oh, isn't this Berriman's?" And I says, "No. We came by the Berriman place." Oh, I'm sorry." So he went back.
So then you knew what had happened.
And then, yes, we knew, but we didn't know any details. So Grandma came home then pretty soon, and she told the details.
You mentioned this telephoning. When did you get a telephone?
When we moved to Gary, they had telephones, rural
They did?
lines. I think there were 18 parties on our line.
That's not so bad. There were 14 on June and Harlow's line when they got married,
Yeah.
40 years ago.
It was kind of hard to get rings that were
But unique.
good. Mhm.
You'd have 2 longs and a short, and 3 shorts and a long and 2 shorts.
When we moved to the Robinson place, we had 2 shorts, a long, and 2 shorts.
When the operator rang that, then you knew you were supposed to pick it up.
Well, you could ring it yourself. Anybody on the line could ring.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and anybody on the line could rub her too.
And they did.
Definitely they did. One woman was
How
accused
else?
of putting her rocking chair on her sewing machine so she was more comfortable.
How else would they get the news, though?
She got it all. She didn't miss a thing.
Well, but everybody knew that everybody else was listening, so you didn't
Yeah.
really get into lots of secrets on the
Oh,
telephone.
that's right.
And some things come full circle. We're back where we don't know where we're bugged.
But when we moved to the Greeley place, we got their phone, and that was 4 shorts, X4. So that's
And that was so when somebody wanted to call you, they'd call the operator and say X4? I mean, that was
on
your
another
number?
line.
Yeah.
But on our line, they just ring 4.
Right. But that was your phone number.
Uh-huh.
I didn't realize you had that phones were around that.
How did Forrest become courting you?
Dad had horses that he worked in the field. We didn't have tractors or anything. And he had 2 silos to fill for his dairy herd. So he raised a lot of corn, and it took a lot of cultivating. And he always hired boys from town to come out to cultivate in the summertime. They didn't have 2-row cultivators, they just had single. They had 2-row, they didn't have 4-row.
Mm-hmm.
And Forrest was one that came quite a bit. June worked there, Cliff worked there. Cliff says, I'd rather work for Ernie Allenson than anybody else because they always have fried potatoes for breakfast. And
So you got really even more acquainted with Forrest during the time that he would come out and help.
yeah, and then I went to high school with him.
Oh, yes. What was going to high school like in those days? Did you have, and obviously you had the church sociables for entertainment, and were there dances or,
No dances that I went to.
This was
oh, of course
Methodist.
not. We're a good Methodist family.
No, they didn't. I only went 2 years. I suppose it had been a 2-year high school, and then they changed it to a 3-year and then a 4-year.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Forrest had gone the 2 years. Then for the 3rd year, he went to Watertown and lived with his uncle and went to high school in Watertown. And that was the year that I was a freshman in Gary, so he wasn't in school.
Right.
Well, he didn't. He came down with smallpox. There was a smallpox epidemic, and he came down with it. And in this family, there were 3 boys that were in school. And Aunt Jen didn't want them to get smallpox, so she wouldn't let him back in the house
Yeah.
In Watertown.
in Watertown, so he had to go home.
Yeah.
So he missed that year. Well, the next year, they put in the 4-year. So
So he missed a year of school.
well, he did. I don't think I got that all straight. I hope the Gordons don't listen to it. Well, I was only in school with him 1 year, though. And he teased me like everything. Couldn't have been a brother. Teasing wasn't in it. And you see, we only had one classroom. The rest of it was just the high school. And just like you had up here, that one big room we sat in.
Assembly.
They didn't call it assembly, though. It was just, that was a high school room.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had made the library into a classroom. They built on then in a year. My brother went with Forrest's sister. They were practically engaged.
That
They
would be
went-
Aunt Flo?
They went together for years. And during the war, she fell in love with another man, but she didn't tell Earl because she didn't want to. He was in the service and she didn't want to turn him down. But as soon as he got out of the service, then she turned him down. But anyway, Earl told me one day you know, you're apt to have a caller one of these Sunday evenings. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, there's a certain fella in town that wants to come out and see you. And I said, I don't know who you're talking about unless it's Cliff. Cliff Folsom had worked for us, and we were just real good friends, but he really thought a lot more of Miriam than he did me, but we were together in a group. No, he says, it's Forrest. Well, I says, why doesn't he come? Well, he's scared to ask you. And, well, I says, let him be scared then, we'll forget about it. But he asked me, and he came to the front door in the dark, and we don't have electric lights, and I heard that knock, and I thought, can that be who it is? And Dell was married to Dad then, and she says, I think you have company. So I had to get a light, get to the front door. After that, he came to the side door with a little light.
When a gentleman calls on a lady, he should do it up properly.
You see, the front door opened into a big hall, and the hall had a place for a light, but we never kept it lit.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then, by this time, however, your mother had passed away,
Yes.
and your dad went back to Illinois,
Ohio.
and brought back, in a sense, her cousin, which then became your stepmother,
That's
and
right.
her name was Dell. And
she,
this would have been in what year now?
19,
When your mother passed away.
was my mother passed away in 1912, and Dad married in 1914.
and this lady whom he married, of course, is the Grandma Allinson that
Yes.
we all know.
That we all knew, who lived to be 100 years of
Right.
age. But then it was during these high school teenage years that Forrest came a-courting, and the romance blossomed.
Well, not too much. It was but it was, I guess the folks saw it blossoming. I think that's one reason they sent me to Madison. But it didn't do, and that's when it blossomed. Distance makes the heart grow fonder.
So you went 2 years to high school, and then for your last 2 years, you went to Madison, which was then a normal school, a teacher's preparation school. And the work you took there gave you a high school diploma, but it also gave you a teaching certificate, right? Okay, got it. So,
Well, it blossomed then when you were in Madison going to normal school, and would he come to visit you?
No, he didn't, but he wrote letters. And when I went home at Christmas, he came to visit me. And that was the year he was a senior. When I was a sophomore, he was a junior. So, and that was the year that the war broke out. And Cliff Gordon was the logical one to go. He didn't have any thing to hold him, and he wanted to go. He was kind of a wanderlust anyway, but they wouldn't take him. He had tried to enlist, but his ears were bad. He couldn't go. So June went then. June enlisted. And that left Dad Gordon with nobody in the... Oh, that didn't either.
was Grandpa Gordon running a grocery store then?
He was running a livery barn.
Oh, okay.
Forrest was working in a clothing store. He didn't work in the livery barn at all. He had a real good job in this clothing store. And he worked there summers and after school and so forth, and eventually would have been a co-owner in it if it hadn't been for the war. Now, what have I left out that I should say?
Well, it was 1917. He finished high school that year. Is that right?
He enlisted before he finished high school, yes.
Oh, did he?
but he wasn't called until in the summer.
Okay, so he did finish high school. And that would have been the summer 1917, so he was gone for a year and a half.
Well, he was gone a good 2 years, because he went to Watertown in the summer and he was brought back to New York. He landed on the 27th day of July.
Oh, that late. Okay, so it was 2 years. And those 2 years, you had by that time finished your schooling and were teaching. Where?
I was teaching up in Spink County, in the same district that I'd gone to school in. My mother had taught in, but there were several schools in the district. And the one I got was the one that my Uncle Ross had taught so much and lived in our place. And I had a very successful year teaching, socially and otherwise.
But you were writing to Forrest, I presume, and getting letters from him.
That I don't think needs to go down.
Okay.
I didn't write any John letter, but my letters are not always interpreted the way I mean them. But I told him that I was going with this boy, so he immediately marked me off his list, which hurt me terribly, because he had said before he went, he says, you go ahead and go with anybody that you want to, and when the war's over, we'll decide what we want to do.
Makes sense.
And I was young, he was young. So I kept on going with this fellow, and he got real serious. I didn't want him to get serious, but that was where I was rooming, so I had to see him every day, and so we had kind of a bad time. His father was a clown. He always kidding us. The war was over, but Forrest didn't get to come home. He was put on the military police in Paris. The war ended. The armistice was
In November.
that year I was teaching. I didn't know anything about it until I got home. I got to my boarding place. Some schools closed. The parents came and told them what had happened, and we're not going to have school. It was just a big celebration.
Oh,
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Our remembrance is a V Day and VJ Day. Very similar.
Well, Forrest then did return, and
he did call me. I wrote back to him and I said, I'm sorry that you feel that way, but I'm going to ask one thing of you, that you come to see me once after you get back, so I can explain things better than you took it from the letter. Well, he called from New York when he got in, a long distance call, which were not very common in those days.
That's right.
Threw me off my feet. And it wasn't too long till he came over.
Well, now, when he came back from France, his folks had moved from
Hitchcock.
Gary to Hitchcock at that time, so he came home from the service to Hitchcock, which was new to him.
And I had signed up to teach in Hitchcock.
Well, wasn't that a coincidence?
And I'd been to Hitchcock quite a little bit, and I knew a lot of the kids. Well, because the Gordons moved there.
Well, you knew
now,
the
Almeida and I
Gordons,
were
yeah.
real good friends.
Mhm.
And I was in to see Almeida. And John Bixler, I had known, and he met me at the train when I came into Hitchcock to teach. Forrest was living there then, but it was John Bixler that met me at the train. And we didn't go together all that much, but I went with different ones in Hitchcock. Till Forrest finally decided he was going to claim me as his. We were engaged then, Thanksgiving time.
Oh,
Didn't take him very long.
no,
to come
that's
to.
what I was going to say. And you were married the following August.
Mhm.
And lived in Hitchcock for about a year. Beth was born there.
Yes.
And then you moved to Wolsey.
We lived in Hitchcock about 2 years. Beth
Oh.
was 9 months old
Okay.
when we moved.
And was he with the post office then?
Yes, we moved here because he got the job of carrying mail here. He was without work. When we married, he had a real good job that was supposed to be permanent in a store. And he was a good clerk. Everybody liked him. But the Depression hit, and he was the last one hired, so he was the first one to go.
Well, now that's not the 1930s depression. That's the 1920s depression.
Following
The
that big
war
boom after the war was terrible. There was people would have 4 cars. I never saw money like this. Boy that I went with brought me a box of chocolates every night. That was when I gained so much weight.
Well, you were married then, where?
In Gary, in our house. And of course, there's a kind of funny little story about that. Everybody laughs about it.
Oh, tell that. I can't remember it.
Well, we had a nice big house, but it had been built a little at a time. So the parlor was the original claim shanty, and the flooring was not good in the house at all. We had it. You didn't have wall-to-wall carpeting then. They had these fancy rugs with space at the side, so they had those rugs, and then we had an imitation hardwood floor put down around it. It was a Congolium deal. So the floors looked nice. But between the parlor and the living room, the parlor was about an inch lower, the floor, than in the living room. I don't know why it was built that way, but that was the way it was. Well, we made an arch for the bridal couple to be wed under of greenery, and we made it go crossways in the doorway between the living room and the parlor. So that meant the people could be in the big hall, in the parlor, in the living room, and in the dining room, and still
See and hear.
they could see if they were in the right spot, because there were big double doors, all those places, openings. And then, of course, there was a lot of them that stayed out on the porch. There was a door open for that, and a great big picture window from the parlor out to it. And the piano was in the parlor, and so the way we would stand, to be correct, it put Forrest on the low floor. And we were just exactly the same height, and that was me with my heels, which weren't high. I never did wear those real high heels. Put me quite a lot taller than he, and I didn't like that. So I went up to the storage room and got a lot of old ladies' home journals and so forth, and padded that floor where he was to stand, and then put a
Throw rug.
throw rug over it. So he had to get married standing on newspapers, so they said.
Did you then have a honeymoon, or did you go someplace?
No, our honeymoon was very short. We went to Watertown that night. Catherine and Harry took us. They used our car, my dad's car. and then brought it back that same night and picked up Harry's car. Well, I guess it was daylight probably by the time they got home. But we stayed at the, I believe they called it the Lincoln Hotel.
What date was this?
August 19th, we were married,
The year?
1920.
1920.
1920. And the day of the week, Thursday. And
And
so-
who
so we-
officiated?
Forrest's grandfather was a Methodist minister, and our Methodist minister assistant. And my Uncle Ross sang a couple of solos, and his stepdaughter played the piano, and we came down that open stairway. We met at the head of the stairs and came down. And
That's nice.
little Dorothy Hoy was the ring bearer, and she carried the ring in the heart of a rose.
Oh my. Then there was a
I don't
reception.
remember it, but her sister told me that I made Dorothy's dress. I can't remember making it. Don't even remember what it was like
There was a reception then afterward,
at the house.
and
They
the
had-
ladies poured, as they said in those days.
And I don't know. I was in dreamland. I don't know too much about it. They had ice cream and cake, and I couldn't eat any of it. Of course, I wasn't drinking coffee, so I didn't drink any coffee either. But I sat at the table and visited. And they threw rice, of course, and then when I went upstairs, I didn't change my dress. I kept that dress on, but anyway, I threw my bouquet over the banister, so I went upstairs some way. But my suitcase had been hidden outside someplace, I don't know where. And Forrest, of course, left his out there too. And Harry got him in the car. They didn't know. We snuck off. You see, Forrest had been raised in Gary, and he'd been in the service with a lot of those fellows. And they were laying for it. They were really going to give us a shivaree. And Uncle Sam found out about it and told Forrest. He says, you'd better, if you don't want to get the works, you'd better get out of there. So I went out the back door, pretending to go out to Mrs. Jones's. And I don't know how Forrest, where he got out, but anyway, Harry was there with the car, and we got in it, and out we went before any of the guests had gone. And when Grandma Hoyt found out about it, she felt terrible, because she says, we'll get the shivaree. They'll give a shivaree, and it'll be... And, but Uncle Sam stopped him. They were across the road, the whole gang, when we went out. They didn't recognize the car. And so when Uncle Sam came along with his car, he stopped and went over and talked to him. He said, you guys are too late. They're halfway to Watertown now.
And thus, they were married.
So they got no shivaree, but I didn't get to say goodbye to my family like I would like to
Yeah,
have.
that's too bad. But you saw him again.